Host has not allowed participants to
Huh?
unmute themselves. Really? You're unmuted.
Yeah, I am now. It wouldn't let me do it a minute ago, and a message come up.
Oh, you may have just done it too fast. It may have still been going through the process of logging you in, because I don't think there's a setting that I've chosen that prevents people from doing that.
It's probably on the 9th level down or something stupid.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
It's always on the 9th level.
It's always on the 9th level. Yeah. The 9th circle.
Yeah.
Yep.
See, as we were talking about in the chapters, we'll go there straight away, right? In the chapters, we've got the Prince Machiavelli.
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe we haven't come across Dante yet.
Yeah, true.
Well,
the Prince purports to be nonfiction, and Machiavelli, so Machiavelli is, probably they think okay to talk about, whereas Dante is, just a poet.
Well, earlier this week, and maybe we should wait until after the time, but somebody sent me that list of the old videos of them talking.
Yeah, I saw.
Oh, I didn't see that. I didn't see that.
So there's
I've fallen behind.
One is a YouTube playlist of 10 or 12 videos of Adler and Van Doren sitting at a desk, literally talking through almost all of the book.
Oh, cool.
I've watched a couple of them. And then the other one is the same thing, but they're all strung together as one big lump of, 2.5 hours.
Yeah, as I said, thrilling TV.
Thrilling TV, yes.
And my favorite though is, and I don't know, I've probably seen fast, I put them on super speed play because, like Adler says, you read through it fast the first time.
Right.
And it pretty closely mirrors what's in the book from what I can tell, although there's a couple interesting examples, but everyone starts with they're at this big massive desk and Adler is sitting facing Van Doren while Van Doren is sitting there writing some note or doing some kind of piece of paperwork that he finishes up, and then he puts it aside, and then he turns and faces Adler and they have a discussion.
Oh, wow.
But it's super weird. Like every single episode starts out with this game. Like, that's Adler, funny. I'm here ready, and Van Doren's he's got to finish doing whatever he's doing, and then I'm ready.
That's hilarious. So there's a ceremony involved.
Yeah,
like Mr. Rogers putting on his slippers or something.
But what's almost hilarious is there's kind of a naturalness to it for these two guys who've been doing these things. They've written the book, revised the book. Together, they've rewritten and revised the book. They've been talking about these things for ages, and yet they are approaching the topic as if they have never discussed it together before in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a way to go. Yeah, it's funny. That's sort of a narrative choice, right?
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense, and that's what a teacher would do is, yeah, I've taught this class 57 times, but, well.
That's kind of weird. Yeah.
And it's not too different from the comment I think I've made before, but way back when I was at uni, partly because I'd worked before, I had a business address book. And we wanted to have big name practitioners come and talk to us students. So I'm not the 18-year-old sort of wet behind the ears, all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. I've got, Richard Rogers, Norman Foster, Richard Burton, and so on in my address book because we've been working with them. Not them necessarily direct, but they're on the list.
Right.
So I wrote to them on university-headed paper as, I'm with the Architects and School of Building Engineering evening club. If you're in the area at some point, can you stop by for normally a Tuesday evening, couple of hour chat? And like 4 of them said yes. And it's like, we were getting like the local, previous guy was like a local guy for highways from Bristol City, because he happened to be in Bath that day, stayed home. And then the following week it was Richard Rogers. But Richard Burton from a company called ABK, they did, not sure they're still in practice, but they did a load of Oxbridge College buildings. And I hadn't worked with him, but I knew Richard from the talk he'd given to us at work. So I said, can you come and do similar? He did. He didn't do similar. He did exactly the same.
So you got to see somebody working off their same notes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure he had any notes. It was like, I know this talk well enough. Yeah. And then like 10, 12 years ago, I was giving one of my first big conference papers. And I did it. And then I got asked by the same corporate to do a similar in Kuala Lumpur a year later. And I thought, I've got to at least chuck half of these pictures and cards away, because some of the audience is going to be the same.
They'll recognize it. Yeah. Yeah. It's weird because, as I've sort of been thinking about shifting from, teaching the same, especially with survey courses, you do this, it's off the same PowerPoint, right? Out of the same textbook, which in my case, I wrote. It is kind of weird. I often, because a lot of the stuff that I talk about in different classes is kind of adjacent and chronologically kind of happens, although they do. I mean, it was weird for me when I would teach world history, modern world history, and US 1 simultaneously, right? Because there's a lot of overlap chronologically, right? Modern world begins, at the Renaissance, or maybe sometimes at the plague, and then carries on from there. So we're always, with maybe a week offset. We were talking about kind of the same time period, and I would have trouble kind of remembering whether or not, I'd be in one class and I say, have I said this to you yet? And they'd be like, no, we haven't heard this yet, because I would make this, I would make similar points about kind of broad topics like the Enlightenment or industrialization or whatever. Which you cover similarly in the U.S. and in the outside world. It's kind of weird.
But if you're doing the world one and you're backing it up with the US focus one, then partly to not repeat what the kids did at school, you might want to make the world one with no US content. Let them fill in the gap. So you do it from the Italian or the German or the British point of view, etc., etc., etc. Intersect sections.
Right. It's kind of weird.
Well, the other thing is, don't worry so much about repetition, because that helps reinforce.
Sure.
Where it's like they read it the first time, now they're getting the second time they hear it's an analytical reading, which is probably what you need with the types of jokes Mark would be telling in a lecture. or if you accidentally do tell the same joke twice and somebody says, well, professor, you told that joke last week. or 2 weeks ago, and your response would be, yeah, well, you didn't laugh the first time, so I thought I'd try it again.
Yeah, trying out material. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it is kind of weird though to think that there are sort of go-to topics in these, that I sort of choose to kind of focus on. It's oh, here comes Annie. Hello, Annie. So morning. Actually, I'll be teaching. I'll actually be teaching the World Survey, the first half of the World Survey for the first time online in the spring. I usually teach World 2, or I was teaching World 2, but then I handed it over to the other guy who can teach it because he didn't have enough, really, enough courses in his, in his kind of rotation things.
I heard you say that this morning, and I was wondering, why would you put yourself through that? Maybe because
final semester.
For me, putting together a new course the last semester, let's say before I retired, I was like, I wouldn't be real motivated to do that.
Yeah, I want to, I guess.
I just wondered if you thought maybe you're going to write in that area then.
I probably will. Yeah, I'll probably, I think there isn't, I guess the ulterior motive for me is online content, and, and possibly I may develop some ideas about writing an OER for, for ancient and medieval, and that would balance the OER that I wrote for modern. Yeah, it's yeah, it'll be interesting. When we were, it was kind of just this weird thought that came out just sort of spontaneously in this conversation, and it did. It was, I thought, well, okay. I was originally going to teach Latin American history, which I've taught before at BSU, so that would have been just a kind of. Oops, sorry. Oh, okay. Background noise. Yeah. So I think it'll be interesting. It'll be something to, kind of occupy my attention. I think by that time I'll be wanting to have something to occupy my attention.
And in terms of writing, I noticed you haven't really slowed down now that you've sort of rejigged the videos of the journey, our journey at that.
That wasn't my idea. Somebody said that in the comments, said hour, and I thought, hour, that's interesting. Us, the us thing. And I just.
I enjoyed the meta one. And there's no mention of Facebook or WhatsApp or Instagram.
The metaverse. Well, that, I could have. If I was going to do that, I would have credited Neil Stephenson with inventing the term metaverse. Because I think not William.
But as a slight aside on that, knowing that we're sort of indie web fans generally, Mastodon and all that, I noticed that Threads is now Fediverse enabled.
Is what?
Threads, i.e. Meta's version.
Yeah, Facebook. Yeah.
Meta's version of Twitter is now Fediverse attached.
Oh, really?
So you could share content between Threads and Mastodon and etc. How up and running it is and what immediate restrictions there are, I don't know, but it's announced and it's connectable.
Well, even Threads, when they started, there was a lot of functionality kind of missing, but possibly better for those who run their own websites, or folks like Dan who has a WordPress website. I've got a friend he's been working on it since 2016, and Automatic, the company that owns WordPress.com, hired him and essentially bought the plugin he was building. But you can now add a plugin to WordPress, and people can subscribe to your WordPress website as if it were part of the Fediverse. So Mastodon, longer things, photos, all it's meant to kind of dovetail with all of the specific content types you would see in various versions, in addition to just Mastodon. So
Interesting. Yeah, I have yet. I've been meaning to explore Mastodon, and I really haven't gotten around to it. There have been people who have told me that there's a like Rajiv Jangiani told me there was a big OER community. They had their own
But at the moment, the current default client, the reading client, I don't think is that great. It's certainly not as simply straightforward as Facebook. The only problem there, of course, is that it's difficult to say, because I've had, best part of 10 years plus of daily in Facebook almost. So it just flows, and it's like moving from sort of Microsoft Word into Obsidian. It's like, whoa, where'd the ribbon go? And the annoying thing, if you've not done Markdown before, of course, it's certain punctuation marks are commands, and it's like I still type what I think I should be typing, and the next thing I know is it's going whoosh. Oh, okay. I shouldn't do, exclamation mark or whatever. And
right, yeah, double exclamation mark or double $sign. That's the one that always trips me up.
Or it's not even so much the double one. It's you put in a square brackets, because I tend to use normal parenthesis or proper parenthesis in text, and I use curly whirly brackets for this bit's not finished, put some more in here as a note, right? And the square ones I'd always use for references, and of course I can't do that now because it means something else.
Yeah, I use the single square for things that are not in the original quote.
Yeah, but in Obsidian, you type one square bracket, it types the other one for you.
Ooh, yeah, mine doesn't. Oh, we got two Johns.
Oh, there are two Johns.
Or you can turn that feature on or off in Obsidian, whether auto-complete those tags or not.
Right. Yep.
Wish I could turn it on for MediaWiki.
Hey, John.
Morning.
How you doing?
Hello.
Good. Overslept a little bit.
Oh, come on. We know you were in the middle of a proof, and you just don't want us to think you're as big a nerd as we are.
The middle of a proof. So so now probably everyone who's gonna be here is here. So we should probably, do we want to begin at the beginning? Where do we want to start talking today?
I don't know. Something interesting, I suppose.
Yeah. What kind of jumped out? Okay, I need to turn off my notifications there. I'm getting a lot of dings. So we came to terms with the author. Have we done that already? Have we come to terms?
So technically, we're supposed to talk about 9 through 12, I think.
Yeah. So determining the author, we're beginning with determining the author's message, and that kind of does begin with with this propositions, that kind of statement that you responded to, Annie, that propositions are nothing but expressions of opinion unless they're backed up, which might be kind of an interesting place to start. I don't know, I am fascinated kind of with that that distinction between the authorial kind of authority and argument and evidence. And then the reason, you know, I read Hayden, I actually was sort of drawn back to commenting on Hayden Smith this week because he's always, for me, kind of that antidote to that sort of objectivity thing in historiography. For a long time, historiography was really sort of obsessed with this question of objectivity and subjectivity.
I mean, this is not exactly related, but I just happened to do this not by accident. Look at the evaluations for this book,
Mm-hmm.
and I was surprised. Well, not necessarily to the great range. I mean, you know, of ratings, and then how it comes up. You get both some highs and some lows, and the reactions to the perceived attitude of the writers.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to wonder about what if you could track that across the decades here for the time period in which this book has been out. And
I mean,
if
I think
you're just reading this book now because somebody recommended it, I wonder if kind of what you're looking for in an explanation for how to analyze something would have changed such this very step-by-step, I don't know what you would call this approach would now be regarded as kind of out of step.
if you're looking for the reviews over time, because that was the sense I got what you were saying, I think that's doable if it is possible to download the CSV or something from all those reviews, then just use data analysis software to plot them over time. But I don't know if that's even doable because I don't know which site's allowed to download the reviews.
I don't really want to do that, but I was just curious about if our standard of, let's say, educated people and how they evaluate such content changes, and that this, because a lot of the negativity I took from, maybe these are more recent comments, and just kind of the attitude, the overly scholarly approach.
Yeah. Well, and that
doesn't
sort of
set us well.
magisterial tone, I kind of felt a little bit of that. I did, I do think that probably it was different before the internet. So the things that people might have said, 25, 30 years ago, which would still have been a long time since the thing was originally published. But if we went back, halfway, to 1940, would still be,
Well, I mean, for example, the chapter about, I don't remember which chapter this was, the chapter that had to do with ancillary tools, dictionaries and the sort, whatever the chapter. If in fact that, the reaction to say something like that would have changed when many of these tools now are embedded, such that in Kindle I can select a word and get all kinds of information about it. Instead of turning to a different book and getting it off my shelf and whatever. So what in fact, I mean, if we're more negative, for example, to this kind of I don't know, I call it an overly scholarly approach, is rooted in, maybe we use different tools and have different attitudes about how to delve into something deeply nowadays.
Yeah.
Or delve more quickly, so you don't have, I don't have to go to the library anymore to pull a book off the shelf. I can go to any number of sites and automatically download an entire book. Right. Or I can get, a lot of times I'll go to archive.org and find the book, check it out for an hour, read the 8 paragraphs I want to read, or go to the index and see if there's a thing, or even better than going to the index, sometimes I'll just search for a couple of keywords that I know I'm interested in. And if they exist in the book, they'll pop up. I'll see them. I can read those paragraphs or pages and then move on. Instead
even the recent remedy for misinformation, false information of lateral reading, which is pushed as a way to evaluate ideas that you counter all the way down into elementary school, in fact. It's similar to, and well, I don't know, we haven't gotten to the section about, multi-document integration, which is
Syntactical reading, I
where
think.
this eventually leads. I mean, we're teaching that kind of concept now in elementary school.
Is
Although
it
it's
taken, do you think?
I was going to say doing that is a lot harder though when it's at the level of a tweet. Less likely to say, is this tweet true on an individual basis because it's so easy just to keep scrolling. But that's kind of the fun of a lot of these methods is I can have, and usually I'm doing at the level of my own. So I can have this index card with an ID and this one, and I can compare the two directly and decide, is one more true than the other, or what is the difference? Or I can create 5 more and then move them around and figure them out. But you can't do that with tweets, at least easily. It's
I mean, personally, I also think because Dan was again like talking about the magisterial style that the authors take. I mean, I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, but maybe I'm the only one. But I actually enjoy such a style. I also read Sertillange's The Intellectual Life, which is the red book in my thing, and they also take. Well, I don't know if I'd call it magisterial approach, but more like that kind of prescriptive writing style. I think I personally actually prefer that. I was specifically looking for recommendations of books that were similar to The Intellectual Life, simply based on the style, because I just enjoy that.
Well, some of that, it may even just be the time period it was written in. I mean, Shakespeare seems more like Shakespeare because of the time he was writing, as much as what he was writing and the words he was using. If you write in Old English, you seem a lot more learned than you might otherwise.
There is that does kind of create a commonality between people who write in that time, but probably there is also a kind of a commonality in the assumption of there being a canon, right? And there being this kind of Western tradition. I mean, they're in the 70s. They're still, when they're revising this, they're still sort of embedded in that, and it really hasn't. I mean, postmodernism is something that no one really knows about at that point, outside of very, very kind of specialized, folks in the academy. So that hasn't really. Culturally, I think it was a different moment, right? There was still this idea that there are things, and for a lot of people, there still is, or like to get back to something that's more like that, at least.
Or I noticed in your, comments, annotations, I think from last week, you made a comment somewhere in there about the section on speed reading, and that they overemphasized it, which, one certainly would do in the 70s when that was the thing, and everybody thought, oh, it's all about how fast you can read or not read, particularly in an information overload society where there's so much, and you feel like you have to consume it all or you're missing out. And to me, one of the interesting takes that I'm surprised they didn't double down on is, finding the better, more interesting material and go all in on that. I think in some of the mentions or even in the videos that I've hit linked to, both Adler and Van Doren say they've read some books 25 or 30 times over the span of their 50 plus years. And it's like, wow, if you can keep getting something interesting out of the old classics, particularly a lot of better, deeper material versus, the 10 million tweets you read yesterday that, here and gone, then go ahead. Or, if you're a big fan and you're still getting something out of the 40th watching of Shawshank Redemption because it's such a well-structured story, or something like Chinatown, then yeah, watch it one more time. You
Mhm.
know,
I mean, no offense, Dan, but like those kinds of parts of reviews are the reason I don't read normal reviews right now if I want to know what the book is about. I just inspectionally read them. Why? Because I think too many people, I'm not saying that you do, but in general, a lot of the reviews on non-fiction books are actually subjective and based on whether or not someone liked it. But I don't have anything about that. If you want to review a book or rate a book, do a rating based on objectivity that is correlated with the context the book was written in, the time period, what the author had access to, etc. Because only then will I know if the book is actually useful.
yeah. My favorite, there was on the reboot of Sex and the City, and just like that, the second season, there's an episode where Sarah Jessica Parker has, I think it's the second season, she's written a new book essentially about grief, and I won't give any spoilers for those who haven't seen it, but she's written a new book, and a book blogger is interviewing her for her book blog. Has no idea who Sarah Jessica Parker's character is, hasn't read the book, doesn't even know what the book is about. And so when she's talking about it, and the book blogger's like, no, really, what is it really about? She's like, and suddenly Sarah Jessica Parker realizes she hasn't read it. She's just, she's like, give me something good for the content, because I'm too busy creating content to actually consume anything or add any insight or, and I'm like, yeah, this is where Western civilization is.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and the scene ends with Sarah Jessica Parker fumbling her computer notebook so that it closes flat and ends the call, and she just walks away.
So I'm not sure, Matthew, whether what you were talking about, what you were responding to me, was what I just said about Adler and Van Doren, or what I've been doing in my historiography reviews.
Sorry, I did not specify that. That was a response, or at least it sparked what Chris Aldrich said about your note about the overemphasis of speed reading. That was what sparked my thought about this. So based on that thought, because I had this a few weeks ago, or even a few months, I kind of lost track of time. I went actually to How to Read a Book by Adler, and I went to his rules for criticism, etc. And I actually created a small Python program to help me not only write objective reviews, but also get a calculated rating between 1 and 5 stars that are more or less objectively accurate for the usefulness of the book. So that was something I did, which I pretty much use every time now when I read a book analytically and criticize it.
Oh, see, but because I think more so, I mean, I did think that the emphasis on on speed reading was a product of its time, obviously, but I also, I guess the other thing that I think is probably more relevant is that I do think that probably because of their time and their sort of embeddedness in this culture of canonicity and authority, they are more objective, and they're less interested in. I'm more interested in the subjective element. I'm more interested in the reader's goals, I think, probably, than they are. And I've been mentioning that several times throughout as I've been making notes as well, because I think that is a big. I mean, and going back to Luhmann and Ahrens and those conversations that we've had, around those books and articles, and Scott Shepard's thing as well. I think that I think that it really. I think it's incredibly important what you go to a book looking for. So what Chris was saying about the going. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'll continue. Go ahead.
I was going to say I definitely agree with the need for subjective goals, your own reading goals and stuff like that. But what I was saying was that I personally think that too many people, maybe not you, because I don't know how you review, but that was what sparked it. Like, that too many people actually put reviews on nonfiction books based on their own goals and based on whether or not they actually liked a book. But I think sure, an element of enjoyment is valuable, but that's more suited towards fiction. If you want to rate a non-fiction book, you should rate it based on what is the author trying to accomplish, not what am I trying to accomplish. Because if you base a review purely on your own needs, then the community won't have any value out of it. And that's the purpose of a review, to help the community.
Maybe it is. Maybe that's a purpose. I don't know if that's the only purpose. I guess maybe I'll go back to the example that we mentioned. I don't know if I mentioned or somebody else did a little bit earlier. I think maybe Tim mentioned it, of the Hayden White meta history review. I guess it's a review. It was my response to the book that I put up on my historiography page of my Substack this week, and that one, I think there is a subjective element to that. I disliked the way that Hayden White wrote that. I think that, and I went to that book having read some articles of his that I really enjoyed, and I thought he made really important and valuable points in a way that was engaging and everything. I think the way that he wrote meta history was unfortunate, and I think it was unfortunate as an act of communication. It was unfortunate in his. I think his presentation actually got in the way of the ideas that he was trying to present. So I disliked it from a stylistic perspective. I thought it was way too dense and difficult to parse, way more than it needed to be, right? And so I do criticize people for sort of unnecessarily obfuscating things just to be precious.
That's definitely good.
And that was a dislike. That was an emotional, subjective response of mine to White, because I thought the stuff that and ultimately the review that I tried to write said, what it said was, I think he's making important points. He's just making them so, poorly that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I think that's also good. Like in my, I think even Adler goes into it in the chapter of criticism. I'm not entirely sure because it's been a while, and I'm not even sure if that was part of this week's reading. But what I do know is in my own program for rating, I actually also have a style section, probably with multiple subvariables. But one of them is actually, is the style appropriate both for the genre the author is writing in, or I don't know if you would call it a genre within nonfiction, but you understand, and the audience is trying to convey to. Because if a book is primarily written for scholars and for like specialized people, yeah, then sure, it's supposed to be dense and using highly technical terms, and then it would actually be a good thing. But if it is written for a more broader audience, then that would be definitely something I would give a very negative association.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I guess that does go back to what Adler was talking about. Adler and Van Doren were talking about terminology, about coming to terms thing that was in, I think, chapter 8. That
I think I have a reaction to this kind of book, and I'm talking here about the book about how to read a book, but also more recent books such as Smart Notes, which offer strategies, which offer how to do it, but do that without explanations of why this is helpful or what this has to do with thinking more basically. So obviously I react to things by translating them. So why is skimming good? Well, to me, skimming might be helpful because there's a big research literature on activation of existing knowledge, and skimming is a way to do that, and it shares it's a shared technique with things like other study techniques, for example. But it all boils down to, why does that work? I can understand what you said. I can understand what a smart note is.
Mhm.
And what we keep saying about some of these books is, well, I'm trying these things and they're supposed to be helpful, but I'm not sure they are. So then we start to say, well, I'm doubting if just logic is justification. Shouldn't there be something tied to, here's the way the mind actually works, and here's why it works this way, and here's why this skimming or whatever technique is legit.
That's
Yeah.
why you'll see Reddit forum dedicated to things like Obsidian or Zettelkasten or note taking in general, and every day, every single day, there is a new person who shows up and asks the question, am I doing this right? Or how do you do it? Or even last week, Mr. Horn asking me, is this a good encapsulation of what you're doing? And the question always missing is the why are you doing it? What is the affordance you get out of this particular thing?
Right.
And almost always missing from anyone's writing is, here's the thing I do. This is the affordance it provides for me, either immediately in the near term, or, there are very few people who talk about the ideas of serendipity or what I would call combinatorial creativity that you get out of working with a slip box that you may not see for a few weeks or a few months, or that you just run into that random thing, or you do a search and you find someone's name and you realize, oh, I've come across this name 10 times now. And it's such a throwaway, weird historical name that just means nothing to me. But over time, in taking notes, you may have built up a context that now firmly places that person, and maybe they're at the center of the thing you really have been working on, and you have no clue.
Yep.
But suddenly the light bulb goes on because you can search for it, and oh, I've run across this person now 3 times. I better look into who they are and why all these other authors I've been reading are talking about them.
Absolutely. Or, oh my God, look at all the backlinks that Obsidian is showing me to this name that that had sort of gotten by me. Well, I think that is one of the coolest things, one of the most fun things that can happen in research. I also think that the context is really important, right? Too, because when
context is essential.
Mark, when you were talking, I was thinking, Pooja and Patrice's book about retrieval practice. They say highlighting will get you nowhere. Highlighting is the wrong way to go. Never highlight, right? And it's like, well, okay, I understand why they're saying it in the context of what they're talking about, but that makes no sense if you kind of take one step back and think, well, okay, I'm going to highlight, then I'm going to go back to my highlights and I'm going to write notes based on them. I'm going to translate those into my own words. I'm going to do all these other things that they're assuming that you're not going to do. You're just going to read your highlights and think that you learn, that, oh my God, now I know, I've fed my confirmation bias or whatever, or my availability bias, whatever.
But the reoccurrence of the person you don't know, or the topic even, but for people particularly, that's how you get on my Google Alerts list if you happen to be a live current person. It's a bit more difficult to get on that list if you're not a live current person, but so that list just grows. And it never seems to get smaller.
Yeah.
It's a bit like a TBR list in some respect. But it's also way back when I first started using Google Alerts, I allowed it to give me an answer every day. Don't do that anymore. It's like once a week maximum. So once a week maximum, I might get 4 quotes, stroke references to that name. And in the climate group, there's an Australian stroke American guy who flip-flops between Monash University in Australia and George Mason up on the East Coast. John Cook. Don't ever put the word John Cook into Google Alerts because you'll just and so it takes you a couple of weeks to figure out. Okay, there's a John Cook who's a basketball coach, so he's in the news a lot. So you put minus basketball and then minus this and minus that. So your Google alert gets longer and longer and longer because there's no other way of saying. I certainly don't want to say John Cook, climate change communicator, because I want to see the stuff he talks about that's not communicating climate change in terms of how to communicate climate change. Because if he ever does any work on climate change itself, I still want to see it. You know? So, and within this thing about being objective and subjective about books, I find it very easy, both in fiction and non-fiction, for an author to get on my blacklist. As soon as I found out that Tom Peters and his co-author for In Search of Excellence had made up half the stories, both of them went on the blacklist. But annoyingly, it took them like 15 or 20 years to admit to, oh, by the way, when we sat down and wrote In Search of Excellence, we made up half the stories. Yeah, you can smile, Anne. He's not even a journalist. And it was like, well, okay, I had a bit of a dig around at the time, but I've yet to see the confession come back with, this is real, we lied this is real, we lied that. So it's like, is it the story about my biggest decision this year by a CEO was to take away all the 4 people tables in the canteen and put benches in and canteen tables so that people had to sit next to different people. It's a nice idea because I know full well that the same 3 or 4 people go to lunch in a big corporate if they can a lot, right? And you want to churn it up a bit in some respects, you know, have the cooler talk at lunch, just at the cooler. So it's like, it'd be nice to, if you're going to confess and go on a shit list, you might as well do some reparations over it, you know. So yeah. It was just wonder how the sort of Matthew put some mathematical one into that retrospectively, because you never know that one on at the time. And it's the same as say like Jeffrey Archer as an author.
You wouldn't necessarily know it, but you could generally suspect anecdote-based presentations like that, right?
Yeah, but In Search of Excellence was all anecdotal stroke, having references. But I wouldn't mind betting that a lot of the ones that they made up, they made up in an article somewhere and then they just used it for the book. So there'll be a reference. It's not like an empty quote or somebody that may not even exist.
But it was, yeah, that was a popular version of that. But I mean, business schools for decades used Michael Porter's academic version of In Search of Excellence, you know, Competitive Strategy and all those other books. I mean, they were all anecdotes about why Lincoln Electric was so wonderful. You know, it's, I mean, very, very, very contingent. A history like that, but you know, you generalize, you kind of draw general lessons from it that, you know, that are fabulous. You know, narrativity is great, but is it I mean, that's why, and that is what one thing that I did appreciate about Hayden White was he went all the way back to Aristotle and said, narrative is argument. But I could change the subject here a little bit if you'd like. One of the things that struck me.
Let me make one more comment.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my reactions also is that I don't doubt that these techniques work, these strategies work. Basically, for all kinds of reasons, mostly the more I analyze and the more I think, no matter what I'm doing to motivate those actions. I mean, all this stuff, all cognitive psychology, all of this stuff to me is just a fancy way of thinking, well, if you think a lot and you think in different ways and you spend the time, your understanding and your retention is going to be improved.
Mm-hmm.
But a more important question is, if I spend the amount of time doing the things that Adler says I should do, I'm limiting the scope of my input. I could read 2 or 3 books in the time it would take me to read one, but in the method, using the methods he specifies. The question then becomes, in the end, which would have produced the most understanding, the greatest breadth of knowledge in me? It would be better to read 3 books or read
That
one.
depends on personal goals, I think.
Well,
Of course, but let's say, but that's all I'm saying is, to me, I'm always looking for, is there really a better way to do things, and what does better mean?
Yeah.
I don't think he focuses, or they focus enough on that in this text, but in at least one of the videos of the discussion about this text that a couple of us were talking before we really started. So for context, I put in the community chat, there's a series of 12 or so videos Adler and Van Doren made as a dialectic version of this book. And in there, and I did a quick search. I don't think it's in the book itself, but Adler says specifically, I may read 100, 150 books a year. And by that version of reading, he's saying I do a quick cursory glance through of something. So I think they were going through and sorting books. Literally, in one of the videos, they had a table full of books, and they went through inside of 3 minutes and categorized them into, kind of fiction, nonfiction, and even fiction. It was fiction, poetry, and then they broke the nonfiction down into philosophy and math, and it was an interesting exercise.
I actually do that myself.
But Adler pulls out a book that was a biography of a president, and he's like, yeah, he's like, this is an interesting book. Or I may have been another episode where Van Doren gives him 3 books that he thinks he might be interested in, and Adler looks at the 3 and does a quick surface evaluation. He's like, yes, this biography of this president, or autobiography, it's something I want to read, but it's something I'm only going to give a cursory glance to. I'll skim through it one time and it's done. That's the most I'm going to ever get out of that book. Versus Van Doren gave him a copy of Macbeth. and of course Adler's like, well, of course, I'm sure I will read this book again. I've read it 30 times already. And he's ready to kind of put it down and set it aside. And Van Doren says, no. He's like, this is a special copy of this book. It's got the text on one side and an interleaved version that somebody's written a lot of interesting notes on. He's like, I thought you would appreciate it for the separate perspective that the notes on the book will give it as you read it again, whenever you happen to read it again. And then suddenly the book, in Adler's estimation, goes up 5 notches. Like, oh yeah, that's kind of an interesting thing.
Mm-hmm.
But to Mark's point, Adler will read 100+ books a year in a a cursory surface way.
Mhm.
He specifically says, I only read maybe 5 or 10 books a year in an analytical, deeper way,
Mhm.
and go from there. So I'm not sure that they do enough justice to the different types of reading here. They mention them and they talk about them. And I think that's one of the tensions Dan has is I'm sometimes reading for something else as an individual. I may not be reading for why the author wrote the book, but I'm going to dip into it and get something out of it that I personally came for. And you don't need a super heavy, deep analytical read for that. You can skim through it, look at the book for 20, 30 minutes or an hour, get most of what you can out of it. But then you can also read those 4 paragraphs you came only for those things and leave the rest.
Right.
And every book does not, and I think that's their point, is every book does not require a deep analytical read.
Mhm.
But if you're into cognitive neuroscience and that's your area and you're reading that thing, then yeah, this may be the book of the year and you're gonna spend a huge amount of time on it. So for example, Lynn Kelly's book Knowledge and Power, I've been through 3 times and I have not pulled out everything that I'm ready and done to be pulling out of that book.
Mhm.
And most other people, they're going to read the Dust Jacket, and that's
Can
it.
you
They're
throw a
moving.
link to that in the chat, because that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if you are coming to a book because something you've read somewhere else has sent you there, or via a keyword search into Google Books or Google Scholar, and you pick out your 4 pages, 10 paragraphs, whatever it is, providing you've got a good note that knows where it came from, and ideally even knows why you were there, then you also know when to go back when it sort of resurfaces,
Mhm.
either because, I've now got 6 backlinks to that skim read snapshot that I took. And that's as we've been saying, that level of hug and cuddle your notes as you go and make sure you fill all the fields in. If you set up a proper template in your book notes, and you always use the book notes for whichever level of reading, and you put the level of reading down so you know that, this is only a level 1 skim. I've only got 4 paragraphs noted. That's why, because I only skimmed it because I was looking for those 4 words or whatever. Then you know what you did, you know why you did it, and you know, okay, I can go back because I've still got the PDF or I've still got the EPUB on the laptop or whatever, or on a separate hard drive. You've got some chance. Whereas if you skim read it for those 4 words and you go, here's my 1 paragraph, but no peripheral to know which book it came from. It's just a post-it floating in midair, no links yet. Then when you come to link it, what do you do with it? Or more importantly, what do you do next with it? You put 1 link in.
Yeah.
Right. But you've got no further content. So the other, as much as there's been the likes of Nick Milo and Nicole van der Hoorn and all the rest of it on Obsidian. There's the other guy who doesn't show himself up on the video, but he used like a manga type character, John Maverick. So John Maverick's channel has just taken Tiago Forte's parable and said, if you follow the idea, not the letter of the law, but the idea of the para system, this is what your Obsidian template might look like.
Hmm.
And therefore he's using things like data view and the new properties instead of tags. And as and when things attach to it, that note outside of not just links, but the actual content of that note grows automatically. And of course, if you then use an Anki type program or use one of the internal things that says, show me all the notes that I modified this week for your GTE type end of week review, you see all that come back. And then you know which notes to go back to. You can tag them in, oh, that needs to be next Wednesday afternoon review read or whatever. Or you add a few topic tags or topic property in to make sure it's attached in a proper way that you can find it again, or it finds itself for you when you write about the topic again. It just seems to be, the thing for why would you use Evernote or Google Notes or Google Docs? No, systems. Read your James Clear. Systems beat goals every time.
How about this? I think I have a reaction to this book because I think there's a subtext, an unspoken subtext, which amounts to there are great books that are worth reading. Look at all my examples. I wouldn't read any of those books, probably, and I haven't read any of those unless they were assigned in the class I got stuck taking. Right? And yes, I understand there is a certain definition of a great book, but that's also, an opinion about what things are worth knowing and what things I want to know. That's quite distinct from what is effective reading.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'd rather read and understand a good book on organic gardening, and I can apply these principles, and I might apply these principles to such a book, because I think there's something quite practical and something quite useful and some things quite societally valuable in understanding those things. I'm not sure that I would make the same argument for most of the examples they provide, and that comes from a perspective that I think good writing requires that you understand the message you're sending to your readers. And there's a certain message that comes from the examples you use. And I think what they've done is off-putting, let's put it that way.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I think that is an element of that embeddedness in that tradition of the canon. I was thinking of it kind of in terms of Thomas Kuhn. It's normal science, right? It's that thing that that we're just sort of at refining it and admiring it, and we're not breaking the paradigm. We're not coming up with a new thing. Sorry, I cut you off there, Tim.
But the thing, if we go back to the previous book, Big Man, there was a lot of stuff there and elsewhere that came up in the chat where right-wing Republicans put out stuff with no real attachment to them, because they invariably made a little activist group that was, cowboy mums of Texas or whatever, right? And were giving out what appeared to be unbiased advice on certain things. And then they'd sneak a few bits and pieces in the same way as when Reader's Digest did the Havek's book and Adam Smith's book stuff, they were leaving big chunks out because those chunks went the opposite way.
Mhm.
This comes over to me as being, I'm giving you these examples without telling you why I'm giving you these examples because
Because it's obvious.
No, it's not obvious. Why would we, at the point of doing organic gardening, for instance, sticking with Mark's example,
Mhm.
why do I need, never forget about Aristotle or Plato. Why do I even need Galileo or Newton? I don't.
Mhm.
But likewise, I don't need all the biodynamicists to act who thinks things happen because the moon's in a certain space. And I don't need the Catholic Church to say, oh, don't forget about Leviticus. Don't put two different crops in the same field. Organic gardening tells you to multi-polyculture every bed, if not every row.
Mhm.
So, no monoculture, please. I mean, you get stuff on Facebook where they've got a lawn and 2 trees saying, look at this terrible monoculture. I can see at least 5 species. There's 2 trees, it's almost no lawn, especially European areas. Almost no lawn is 1 species. We don't even do 1 species lawn here. We do 3 species because we need a lawn to be all year round. We need different species of grass for different seasons. We just sow them in together. And then the one that goes dormant. So we're cutting 2 species at the most of the year. So it came over as being, if you went to the Vatican and asked them for a good reads list, this is what you get. And bless his cotton socks, Adler's Cafe, and a pushy one at that. I'm quite happy with Mark's organic gardening example,
Mhm.
or even earth sheltered greenhouse. There's nothing on the list for us.
Earth sheltered greenhouse.
Oh, I was going to say too that I came up this week for me in a context that's related to this, but I saw somebody who said like, yeah, I have this huge library at home, and I realize I've got 800 books that I've not read. And they were concerned about it as like, oh, I have this collecting problem, and do I get rid of them? Do I read them? How do I stop collecting? And and it happened on Reddit, so a lot of people gave this poor guy a ton of advice that honestly I think was horrific, terrible advice, because they're like, quit buying books and start reading them. But it was all advice from people who I think generally wouldn't know how to read a book if it bit them in the ass. And I pointed out the value of there's an interesting value in the idea of what Nassim Taleb says about an anti-library.
Mhm.
And an anti-library is exactly that group of books that you may have purchased, and it may have been a knee-jerk thing while you were in the bookstore. This looks interesting. I read the back cover and I want to get to it later.
Mhm.
And it's sitting on your bookshelf waiting for you maybe to spend an hour getting the surface material and doing your quick read out of the way first, for you to then decide, maybe I want to read this and go deeper and more analytical into it. But those things don't happen if it's not in your physical environment. You're not going to run across it. So yeah, there are lots of books on this bookshelf behind me. Well, not this particular one. I probably read most of these once or twice. But the bookshelf in the other room with 1,000 other books. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff I haven't read, but they have value because they're sitting there and they're in my environment. And I may pick something up one day and spend a half an hour with it, not reading it the way most people would read something when they check it out of the library and they have to put it back 2 weeks later. But you get more value long term. And almost nobody in this Reddit conversation either thought that way or had the ability to think that way. It's a thing in a house that has no value for sitting there. And they think of it as, I've seen writers use the word, visual furniture or wallpaper. Yeah, this is pretty wallpaper. I have pretty wallpaper behind me, but it has way more value to me than just as wallpaper or decoration. And no one in this Reddit thread of hundreds and hundreds of people taught that distinction. It was just physically, Adler's, version of you own the book only in a possession sense, a physical object sense, not as there are things in that book that you own in your brain. And I just, it was beyond me that hundreds of people, no one had that perspective. And so, like I put in a little nudge, think of it this way instead. And if, no one will see it except for the original poster maybe, but
yeah. There's also value in compost. In things, I mean, to go back to the organic metaphor, right? It takes time to create for something to become compost. Yeah, I like book.
There's another word for compost, but
yeah,
I won't use it.
Yeah, but it's kind of interesting because I don't know if anyone noticed. I do occasionally watch Rumble. And I was watching Rumble the other day, and I was watching Glenn Greenwald, and he was ranting, and I think he was ranting about what's his name, his buddy who's been canceled in England, which is not the point that I want to make. But he's going on and he's criticizing people, and he's talking about people having platforms, and he says, and I was thinking, oh my God, I should record this. He says, yeah, there's the richest person on Substack, he said, is this supposed historian named Heather Cox Richardson. And she pretends to be doing history, but all she's doing most days is all of the left check talking points from the news cycle. And I was like, oh my God, somebody's finally noticed that. But it did. Yeah, it's weird that that we get, oh my goodness, dude, cats are going crazy. Apparently they still like Heather. But yeah, to kind of what you were saying, Mark, yeah, I've bought a bunch of books based on things that were sitting behind people that I thought were kind of interesting for a while. But it does seem like there's, I grab things, I try to put them into sort of at least into Zotero, and into, and then maybe an empty or a kind of a semi, not particularly filled in book note in Obsidian, and then and then find out if they reach some type of critical mass, at which I'll kind of read them. I've got and luckily right now I have interlibrary loan, So I'm able to I just got a book. It was crazy. I looked at it for about 15 seconds and ordered it for $5 on Abe Books. It was excuse me, it wasn't Alan Nevins. It was somebody like that. Somebody from some old historian who had written a series of essays that, you know, over a period of 20 or 30 years that went, you know, that went into this book. And I looked at it and I just, you know, I got it through interlibrary loan. I looked at it, you know, I flipped through it and I thought, oh yeah, I'm going to want to read these someday, sometime. I'm not sure exactly when, but you know, it's worth $5 to have, you know, this book from 1962 sitting on the shelf until, you know, I want to, you know, until I want to kind of dip into that and see what this guy said about Thomas Jefferson, you know, historiographically in 1962.
But collections like that have got to be one of the most difficult things to tag, such that Obsidian would surface it, because, you know, okay, if it was Stephen Jay Gould, for instance, each collected volume has a certain amount of a theme, so you've got a chance. But if this guy has just effectively randomly collected 30 years of articles, and it's, other than it's been written in English, that's about it that's common apart from his name. You've got a real problem of trying to have, you got a system to get it back on the top of the TBR.
I probably won't read every article, but I am, you know, I you know, to the extent that I'm interested in kind of historiography of the, you know, and kind of what happened as the consensus was breaking down in the historical profession. Yeah, there will probably be some, you know, some things that will, you know, that will kind of hold my attention. And that I might be able to connect to other things. I guess that was the other thing that struck me as we were talking earlier, was this, you know, sort of the idea that, you know, there's a, I mean, I think that they're trying to talk to too wide an audience. I think that they're trying, you know, if to the extent that they're trying to talk to people who are just learning to read analytically, you know, then I think it makes sense to say, okay, there's more in this than you're aware of. Do not, you know, when they're talking about how to, you know, how to sort of evaluate the author and, you know, and criticize the author, you know, they are at a couple of times, and I was just saying, you know, show some respect, right? This person might know more than you know about this topic that they, you know, that they were expert enough about to get a book contract and to, you know, and to have somebody, you know, pay them to write about it. But then also, you know, sort of that, you know, I used to, I remember when I was a kid, I used to write notes, you know, I used to, you know, write quotes out of books. You know, this is off, I guess you know, my dad was a lit teacher, so this was probably more about reading literature and the canonical literature than anything else. But I would write down, you know, a quote, and then I would drop it into an essay, and it'd be like, boom, you know, the authority of the quote was all it, you know, and the beauty of the quote, and you know, if it was literature, you know, was what I was really looking for there. Not, okay, this now is becoming my idea, you know, that whole translation thing that we, you know, that we're always talking about when we're talking about note making, right? That, you know, I'm taking somebody else's idea and I'm making it my idea and using it in my way in combination with other things that I've chosen to put around it. Yeah, I don't think I want to read the poetry chapter either, if there's a poetry chapter. Looking at the notes, I'm not a fan of poetry. I like Frost and T.S. Eliot, but
I have a quirky question that came up in some of the reading I was doing last night, and I've seen variations of it. And I think Annie kind of made an annotation towards that area, but they talk about it here, and Sanka Ahrens talks about it in his context. And there's the idea essentially of the Feynman technique, which apparently Feynman didn't really come up with, Um, but it's the reading something, restating it in your own words, which is roughly what you mentioned, Dan. And Adler even goes beyond the Feynman technique piece of just restating it in your own words and says, to really own it, you need to also be able to come up with concrete examples of the thing.
Right, and Annie
Or
said
I think
analogy.
in Annie's annotation, she said, can you come up with an analogy of that thing in another space? And I only found it because I was digging through my own note collection in the way that only I would. But I saw a reference. I'm trying to remember what the exact word was. Reformulating writing, I think, was the way it was translated from Luhmann's German into English as a thing. But I'm curious if anybody has, at least in a learning space or a learning idea, how you would describe that kind of rewriting something to increase your own understanding and prove that you actually know a thing. Is there a better word? I use the shorthand of Feynman technique because I think it's how it's most popularly known, at least within internet spheres. But I don't know that there's a technical word or phrase to describe that kind of functionality or the idea of that thing.
One of the first most valuable things for me that I did in grad school, and I don't know, it was just this old guy who was teaching one of the intro grad courses in my master's program, had us write abstracts because you're limited to like 250 words.
Yeah, I mean, and that's another good example of it to indicate that I've consumed this thing, I know it, and I can apply it and use it. And even in Bloom's taxonomy, it's can you read it and know it and understand it? Can you analyze it? But then can you synthesize it at the high end?
Synthesize is, I think, the old version of Bloom's taxonomy, but I mean, the principle is still in the newer version, I think. It's more so under evaluation, I suspect.
Yeah.
I think
but I've never seen in an educational or learning setting a good name or tag for that thing, or even an origin of where it started. And Manfred Kuhn, kind of in that annotation I linked to, he jumps from Luhmann's mention of reformulating learning straight into the older kind of commonplacing tradition, which to me is a little bit of a non sequitur, because you were excerpting wisdom from the greats, the church fathers, or the older sententii. But that doesn't indicate that you know anything. It just shows that you're able to parrot back the famous quote.
Right. No, there should be an element of reflection on it too.
So in my notes, it's usually Feynman technique is a shorthand just to give it a name so that I can track the idea of that or where it came from. Or I think when I was reading Aaron's, I wrote down the phrase "writing for understanding," that you kind of write it out, or like we're doing here, we're all talking about the thing in hopes of increasing our understanding of the thing we read. But I'd love to know a more, or I'll have to come up with a more technical word of what that thing is.
I like reformulation or translation personally. I think I said translation in my handbook. I like the idea though that has come up in this conversation about analogy and maybe about about being able
if you want to
analogize is useful, because then you can see the edge of where analogies or metaphors are useful. And that's one of the things that is a perennial issue for me when I'm reading, especially science popularizers for some reason, seem to push the analogy or the metaphor outside of its kind of natural realm of usefulness. I mean, and this is how we get scientism, like social Darwinism and things like that, right? That ideas get kind of pushed past their limits, and we should have more. We should have more of a language, I think, to talk about that as well.
I mean, I think personally, if you want to go more technical in terms of what you said, I think that a more proper term based on initial thinking for this concept itself would be something like reflectory translational writing or something like that. Then you capture the essence of what you're doing. You are reflecting on a piece of content and indeed translating it into your own words. But if you just say translating, then it does not capture the essence of actually converting it to something your own mind understands and has context in. So that's why I would add an element of reflection inside the term, if you want to go technical, that is.
Yeah, I like the idea of adding an element that acknowledges reflection, because reflection, again, is subjective and is based on the interests and the goals of the person doing the reflecting, and that adds that context.
I must admit, I like the Phenomen thing from a perspective that one of his stories he gives about how he was taught by his dad was the naming of the bird story, where he gets something along the lines of, that bird's called a house sparrow, whatever. And the dad comes back and says, yeah, but what does that tell you? Because in German it's called this, and in French it's called that, and in Spanish it's called something else, etc., etc. But it's and to bring it back to poetry, just for the hell of it, just to make my old English teacher happy, Miss Duffel, one of the poems that we did that bracketed the World War One poets section of the normal British education, and the absurdity of Ogden Nash and Old Possum's book of cat curiosity poems. So McCavity sticks in my mind forever. There was a poem that was called The Naming of the Parts. And this, I think, was unusual in the sense it was an American poet from World War One. And it's a bit like the bit you see in Platoon where they're sleeping with their rifles with the bolt out. But it's the naming of the parts of the gun as how you strip it down and put it back together again. And I've never been able to find it properly again since. But we do seem to have an element of, if we know its name, we have a certain amount of power over the thing because we know it. Whereas John Cook is a perfectly good name. And my name turns out to be the other person on LinkedIn that's got my name mostly. Is a guy that runs an oil exploring company in the Falkland Islands. So I wonder how much a phrase or terminology. I mean, I got it at work because back in the day, my main primary function was to commission systems in buildings. So it's physically built. It may even be physically tested. So it's, the cabling's right. It's not leaking. The next thing you want to know is the motor going the right way around so it blows instead of sucks, etc., etc. And when I was doing hospitals, there was a bunch of senior nurses and doctors that came in to commission the hospital. And I was sort of, fuck off, I've done that, go away. And he, no. We're doing the hospital commissioning, as in all the medical systems are in place such that we know where all the right buttons are. So you've got to train us on where all the technical bits are. And one thing we do jointly is, there's all the gases that go to the bedhead and go to various parts of the surgeries to make sure we don't, knock somebody out with anaesthetic down the oxygen tube, which is somewhat important. So the same word so often gets used in multiple ways, and it's so easy to misunderstand simply because you think the person's using the same word as you use it.
Terminology. I'm just scrolling through this. I guess I'll skim the poetry chapter. It is. I mean, it is like kind of dipping into a time capsule.
Well, you got to remember too, at least in their enterprise, they're as interested in some of the, fictional and poetry writing. And I think Van Doren's dad was also an English professor and focused on a lot more on poetry and older poetry.
Mhm.
So, but even at that, I think too, a lot of what we miss in our older poetry is the oral nature and the oral beauty, and even worse, we miss the memories and the mnemonics that were also attached to those older oral forms.
Mhm.
So we can only appreciate them for the words and the sounds, because we don't get, it's that watching the Simpsons episode where we're only seeing the surface level as if we've seen none of modern culture.
Mhm.
So you only get the surface level of what's there. You're not getting any of the references
Right.
that are coming along with it.
So that's like watching a Disney movie as a child.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that they are concerned with sort of tangentially kind of concerned with truth claims in fiction that are different from truth claims in what we think of as nonfiction. But to go back to Hayden White, I think that a lot of the truth claims in nonfiction are sneaky fictional truth claims. Oh, what do we got here? I've already done that. What is it? What's the? Ah, nice. All right, that's a lot. There's going to be some homework from today. What about this list? I mean, they've been as we've been sort of going through this, we've been, they have these big, bold, all cap rules. How are we feeling about the rules?
I think personally that most of them are pretty nice.
Well,
I have encapsulated them into my own reading template as well. The only thing that I personally think is that's like the terminology that creating that table and with propositions and stuff. I've not been doing that as much because I think it takes a lot of time that I personally don't find valuable enough yet to actually do for my own books. But that's my personal opinion right now.
If you look at it in the framing of which they're saying it, those are the important pieces that the authors are telling you. Stop here, pay attention. Here are the important sentences for you to figure out and parse, but to me, they're, for the most part, they're not as deep. They're deep for the novice reader,
Mhm.
but if you've been a heavy reader and you've been reading this way most of your life already anyway, it's, and it's a habit you've either learned or formed or figured out for yourself. But if you're, if I give this to my 12-year-old, it's, and she says no in the background. It's, it's a bold letter. Hey, pay attention to this. This is the important bit. Do this, especially for a how-to book.
I feel like there's an assumption with the rules that more effort equals more learning. And I just don't think that's true in my own experience or in what we know from how we actually learn. And obviously we're in a different time. We've had a lot more research into that in the last 50 years, but there's, these very prescriptive, helpful, great, set of things to go through. But yeah, I think, like you're saying, Chris, sometimes just pedantic. I don't know. It's like, okay, get the terms. That's where we got to start. But working through this series of rules doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get something more out of a book because you put more effort into it. So I feel like that's an assumption that isn't ever dealt with.
I do distinct in that sense between like learning, which I know to a degree how that works, and what I think here in this book, most of the rules can be applied to learning, especially when it comes to inspectional reading and some parts of analytical reading. But other things like the propositions, arguments, terminologies, etc., I think it is more applicable to what I would define as intellectualism, which is different for me than learning itself.
They don't have access to the new modernity, but the traditional story now is most published books probably would have been better written as articles. Most articles probably would have been better written as blog posts. And most blog posts would probably have been better written at the level of a tweet, and then you're done. So it's part of it is how dense or interesting is the thing you're reading. So Graeber and Wengrow is a great thing to delve into and cross-reference and really get your hands dirty, at least for me, versus
Atomic Habits.
But let's unpack that. What is it that makes something valuable to expand from a tweet to an abstract to a blog post to an article to a book?
Or I'll give you a good example. There's Napoleon Hill has a book called Think and Grow Rich. That's been
I have it on my shelf.
Perennially popular since the day he wrote it, and there are 500 editions out. And in that book, you can encapsulate it in a sentence or two, and if you can do it well, you're done. But literally, every chapter he's repeating the same message again and again and again, but each time in a different way, so that if you didn't understand it in chapter 1 and you keep reading, you might figure it out in chapter 2. And if you don't figure it out there, he's going to tell you again in chapter 3. And by the time he's done, he's said the same story about 7 times. And surely one reader or another is going to figure it out, but almost nobody really needs to read the thing. Mm-hmm. Hopefully you get it. But if you don't, he's giving you lots of additional examples that sooner or later, regardless of who you are and whatever walk of life you happen to be in, he's going to tell you. And almost to a T, that's what a lot of how-to book writers are doing is, here's the one bit of advice I've got. So in the note-taking world, our advice is you should have a Zettelkasten, but how much ink has been spilled on the internet for how to do that, why to do that, what specific steps should you take? Which should you keep? Which should you not keep? And 9 times out of 10, it boils down to here's the general form, but take what works for you.
So
and
what
almost
are-
nobody does it past 2 weeks to really figure out what really works for them, and that's where they lose the thread.
Right. So what are the characteristics that make one presentation of those ideas readable or watchable?
I think it's primarily to answer your first question, actually, what determines how big the piece should be. I personally think the depth it contains, the depth of knowledge. That's just how I would describe it.
Or,
I'm not sure I
again,
agree.
as an example, I've been thinking about reframing how all these note-taking books are going about things. Because really it's hi, I'm Tiago Forte. I'm going to show you how I've done it and how you can do it too. But a lot of people are spending thousands of dollars taking classes. And I think at the end of it, they may have gotten nothing out of it other than that they were encouraged to sit down and actually practice a thing to see if that practice worked for them for a few weeks. And if you take the class, that really should be what you get out of it is here's somebody's going to hold my hand and help me actually do the thing for a little bit to see if it works for me. But I would reframe it as here are all these note-taking traditions that have happened over time and all the bits of advice or knowledge. So, should I write on one side of my paper or should I use both sides? And there's 10 authors who all say one thing or another, but almost to a T, none of them says why. Why should you only write on one side? And there are good reasons in the long term for doing that, but no one talks about what's the affordance? What do you get out of when you've got 90,000 cards and you're kind of tipping through 50 of them at once? If you have to take a card out and flip it over to see what's on the back and then put it back in and file it, you've taken going through 50 cards for a minute and made it a 20-minute exercise that doesn't buy you a lot. So if you've only written on one side or you've given a nice quick summary title, those are the things that 20 years from now saved you thousands of hours of time and effort and energy. But nobody's writing that's why you do those things. So here are a bunch of bits of advice. Here are the affordances you get out of them. So when you go to your own practice, you can pick and choose the bits of advice, knowing why those bits of advice may or may not be important.
I think it's interesting too, because I think there's a big element of a wanting to be like X, right? I watched because I had never watched it, and it was a Martin Scorsese movie, and I had heard good things about it. I watched The Wolf of Wall Street last night, and I was very disappointed. And then I needed some type of palate cleanser, but the message there, what Wolfie, Leonardo DiCaprio was selling was his life. All these people that he was sales training wanted to be him. And that seems to be, and so I'm reminded that when I think about, Tiago or somebody like that, or, Tim Ferriss, he's selling, what he's selling is his life, as, and that as an aspirational thing. Oh, if I do this, I can be that, I can have that. On the other hand, I think it's one of the things that I've been kind of, I don't know if struggling is the right word, but I've been thinking about is this, about how particular to get if I'm going to elaborate on something. if I'm going to tell this, like, for example, I was thinking, well, if I were going to create a note making course and put it online, right? How much of my own experience would I put in there? How much of, okay, when I was a grad student, this was the type, this is what a document that I would take a photograph of, in an archive looked like. And this is, so this is a handwritten, this is a handwritten letter that I would have to transcribe. And then when I transcribed it, it looked like this, and, sort of the steps and the details of that. And I think that some of those things can be, can kind of ground the theory in some type of real experience, which sort of validates the advice, right? But, and then on the other hand, I think that, sometimes it's only stories, and it's only the engaging nature of storytelling that is kind of keeping people watching at all. Like when I'm standing in front.
Yeah, I think that personally, indeed, a bit of that can indeed be used to give more solid examples to theory, indeed, as you say, or to give some proof even for certain ideas. However, I think because of the way you were explaining it, especially if it becomes too much, it would better be suited for a biography, actually, because that has the purpose of selling your experience.
Yeah, I think stories are. I mean, it's from every direction. I just keep seeming lately to be reminded that narrative is so central to everything, and we want to attend to narratives, because now that we don't have the oral tradition that Chris is talking about, right, and that oral mnemonic kind of connection. The way that we connect dots is narratively.
Or if we go back to Annie Murphy Paul's book that we read, her idea of it's so much easier to copy someone than it is to innovate.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have millions of years of Acheulean hand axe use. It's just copying from one person to the next across hundreds and hundreds of cultures across the world.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly you have a proliferation of, and maybe it happened in a mind somewhere or it was a cultural thing, but suddenly you've got thousands of different types of axes or cutting instruments. You could spend days scrolling knives on Amazon right now. Mm-hmm. For almost any kind, carpentry, kitchen, the number of cutting surfaces, a penknife here, literally, and a pair of scissors within reach.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just that old Acheulean hand axe anymore. So and everybody is looking for, how are you doing this? And I want to copy what you're doing, hopefully with a reason why, or what are you getting out of it? So a lot of people will come to me and say, like Mr. Warren last week, is this a good encapsulation of what your method is?
Mm-hmm.
And not, why did you do it? What did you get out of it? And those to me are the important questions, is why are you doing these things? Not once, twice, but tens of thousands of times. And what is the value you're getting out of it? And if you're getting value out of it or managing to create massive value, and that's why Luhmann's example of, here's a guy with 90,000 cards, but the selling point almost always was, and he used it to write all this stuff.
Right. 600 books.
So everybody thinks and sees that, and they don't realize it's a small, easy thing to do, but you've got to practice it for 30 years, and you've got to work at it, and you've got to do what Dan said. It's focus, focus, focus. Well, just two focuses, or,
Yep.
or goals, and that's what gets you there. But what happens is you have somebody like Luhmann whose practice was dramatically different. It was very similar to all the rest, but at the same time, in certain ways, dramatically different than others. And I'm not 100% sure that I think the change in his method was so much more dramatically better than anyone else's, because John Locke commonplaced, Newton commonplaced, and they did the same things in more or less the same ways, and they had really phenomenal, impactful writing work that came out of it. There are a handful of, especially Jewish scholars and historians, who did the same thing Luhmann did, but organized it a different way, who also had the same massive output. So was the innovation really worth it?
Focus, focus, focus.
Or not? Or was it just the focus and the goals? Because, Goitein had a third of the number of slips that Luhmann did, but had, almost 3 times the output. He wrote more books and more papers than Luhmann could have in 3 lifetimes, but with a third of the amount of notes.
But in terms of a system and what's being delivered in the book so far, as we've read, doesn't fully yet cross over with, say, Zettelkasten, Kuhn, Sonka Arons, as in, if you're reading, do you literally take each paragraph, make any highlight and or any other added marginalia and carry on? Or do you deliberately read one section between one level of headline to the next and then go back? Or do you wait to the end of a chapter? Or possibly worse still, do you wait to the end of the book? So if you waited to the end of the book and you read the book we did last, I mean, the Big Myth is like 800 and something odd pages as paper. How would you even bother to remember what highlights you wanted to make? So,
you get to the point too, you may read that book and get nothing out of it that the authors wanted you to.
Mm-hmm.
But if on page 150 there's a reference, even a tangential reference to something that makes sense or has value to you, you may write a little annotation in the margin, and you may do it while you're reading it, even on the first skim. And that may be the most important thing you pull out of the whole book, that the author never intended, but because it triggered something in your associative memory that relates to something else, you may excerpt that little piece and take that note and turning it into something wholly dramatically different.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I think that's one of the pieces that's missing from this book on reading, unless there's something hidden that I haven't seen yet. Mm-hmm. But that is wholly, totally missing from this.
But that's why you're reading it again, right?
In some sense, yes, but at the same time, here are 2 experts who, have spent decades looking at reading practices and using their own experience, and they have still missed something that I see as central to the enterprise. And it may be a simple throwaway quick note, or it may be the thing that, turns my entire research enterprise on a dime, and suddenly, I have to go do research into this sub area.
But that's that difference between normal science and when the paradigm is being rewritten, right? Because these guys, I mean, I think what they did was they reverse engineered their own habits, right? And their habits came out of their disciplines. And that's why I do see that as being very much different from sort of what I do in my discipline, because oftentimes I am reading for historical data, but I'm also reading, you know, I mean, historiography is about reading to understand the perspective and the interpretation of people with whom I am not trying to agree. I'm not hoping to agree. I know that I'm doing this for a different reason than to be convinced. One of the most valuable things I got out of Heather Cox Richardson's dissertation was how badly she gets the American banking system wrong. And that actually gave me, but seriously, I'm serious about that. And it was very valuable to me. It was very helpful because it helped me to understand what it is that people didn't understand about the history of American banking. That gave me an opportunity. I don't think I did the best possible job, but I think I began a process of kind of changing, suggesting a different way of thinking about it, because like everybody else, and the thing that I understood about reading it in her dissertation that became her first book was that everybody had been looking at it from the center, right? Everybody had been looking at banking from the perspective of Washington, New York, that nexus, right? Whereas what I was looking at was people in Western New York and in Michigan who were looking back eastward at the things that banking wasn't doing effectively for them and the reasons that banking wasn't working for them and wasn't meeting their needs, although it was enriching the people and providing the political solutions that it was, for the folks back in Washington and New York. So I think that's a different, I think that's something that wouldn't occur to Adler and Van Doren, regardless of how long they spent.
So how is reading not working for modern Americans and and having an educated electorate? What is missing?
Filter bubbles and confirmation bias.
Or how are our reading practices now hurting us rather than helping us?
Short attention spans, definitely. That is something that counts toward it. People are too addicted to dopamine.
Or the emotion of, hey, I'm right and you're wrong, and rather
that too.
Very rarely do you see an internet forum or on Twitter people trying to, in an Adlerian sense, come to terms, and then it's all about I'm right and you're wrong, damn it.
Or we'll use my terms, damn it. We will define the terms the way my club wants to define them.
Yeah.
Sorry, I cannot go to dinner because someone is wrong on the internet.
And it's your job to intervene, you mean?
Exactly.
Well, when it's time to go to, dinner or lunch in a group of people, very often I'll throw out the worst idea first. Like, let's all go to McDonald's. We get a bunch of executives. We're going to walk out and 10 blocks from us, there's 50 options. Hey, let's go to McDonald's. And nobody is going to want to go to McDonald's. But that quickly helps force consensus to at least a good middle of the road rather than everybody listing all 50 restaurants within walking distance.
Mm-hmm.
You will never have, but by being the worst idea, everyone gangs up against me to come up with the better. And they'll come up with it way faster. Smart. Because I've named the worst option first.
That's cool. So we're kind of running out of time. Shall we talk about what we're doing next week? I would suggest we just do part 3 and don't spend as much time on the things that don't interest us. But I think that'll give us probably enough. I mean, it's the approaches to different kinds of reading matter. So it's chapters 13 through 19 It's got the poetries, plays, poems, imaginative literature, practical books, and history. So I'll be focusing.
Yeah, I'm curious what you think about the history chapter.
I haven't read it yet, so yeah, I'll let you know.
Don't forget the science, math, and philosophy.
Yep. I will. I'll probably, and social science. Yeah, I'll probably be interested in all of those. And I will skim through the fiction and imaginative literature and plays, poems, stories, and things, because, like I said, I do think that all, especially story, is just key to everything.
Well, even I remember an essay by Terence Tao, who's a Fields winning, incredibly brilliant mathematician. And he made a list of, I don't know, 10 or 15 different types of math and different areas that one could be good in math.
Mm-hmm.
And he's very good at super high level abstractions, is one of the areas where he excels. But he also is very good at kind of being a clear expounder of how that super high level technical math works. So if you're a working mathematician and you read him, he's generally a little clearer than a lot of others. But then there are also people who are good at telling the math story to bring his level of math down to the level of the everyday. So, you know, one of my favorites is Quanta Magazine. There are a handful of people there who are good at taking super abstract math and analogizing it to other things, so that Joe on the street can understand kind of what's going on.
Yeah.
They're going to be so lost in the weeds.
I listened to
that narrative. It's that narrative piece. Can you tell the story?
Yeah.
And there are a lot of very technical people who are not good at telling the story. You know, or there are people like Brian Greene is a good example. He's written the same damn book 8 times now.
Yep.
He may have known the state of the art of string theory 15 years ago and been able to do it and been able to teach it, but he was not able to break the barrier and unify all these 5 areas from a research perspective. So he has spent the entirety of his enterprise analogizing it and letting the guy on the street know what's going on. And that, you know, he's reasonably good at it, but he's now sold the same book, including, I think, a kid's book of all crazy things. Like, he's written the kid's book version. But if you've read one of his books, you pretty much have read all of his books, because he's not saying anything new.
I was really fascinated to watch him arguing with Eric Weinstein about the failure of string theory to be a theory on something. I think it was IAI. Is that what it's called? But I also tried to listen to the Portal, the 2.5 hour or 2 3/4 hour long Portal episode of Weinstein trying to explain his theory of geometric unity, which wasn't narrative enough. It was interesting, but I was only getting, probably 10% of it.
There's a problem with the state of the art of physics, and I'll boil it down for you. It's for the last several centuries, mathematics as a language was way ahead. And physics has caught up with the bleeding edge of the mathematics. So you really can't do new physics because you don't have the language yet in mathematics to express it.
Which is why
movement forward.
Right, which may be why Weinstein has a little bit of an advantage being really a mathematician rather than a physicist. Okay, then we will do part 3 next time.
Poetry.
All right. Goals.
Can't wait.
Poetry goals.
All right, cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave.
Take care.